All right, today we are building a steel base for a bar height wine table. This thing is pretty big and I don't really have a good way to cut large sheets of metal, so I had my steel supplier shear off the pieces for me. And each piece is covered in some oil and oxidized just from the manufacturing process. So I'm basically using some muriatic acid to etch into the steel and clean that off. And I'm doing that before I weld it all together, just because once it's together it's going to be even bigger and harder to move around and handle. So I think it's just going to be much easier to clean all that off before I weld it together. So I don't think these sheets are going to be strong enough or rigid enough to withstand the heavy top that is going on top of this table. So before we weld those sheets together, I'm going to weld up a frame and then basically clad that frame with the sheets of steel. Alright, so I got my Harbor Freight bandsaw set up here to cut all my material, and for the joints it would be cool to do a 45-degree miter, but this bandsaw is kind of rinky-dinky and does not really cut an accurate angle, and it takes a long time to set up accurate angles, so if I want to switch between 90s and 45s it's just a huge pain. So I am basically notching the steel here. So I'm basically just going to create a little notch on each corner and then weld that together. So that's what that notch joint is going to look like. Alright, my welding table's a little small for this big metal base, but you know what they say, it's not the size of your table, it's how you use it. Alright, so if anybody gets up and dances on this table, I want to be able to weight it down to prevent it from tipping over. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting in a metal base and then welding in some support structure to hold that metal base in place. And then some buckets of concrete will be filled up and sat inside this metal base to add some weight to it to make it really hard to tip over. All right, and then I use that same notch joint to weld in some center supports to give my sheet metal some extra structure to bite to. And then I just went around and tack welded the sheet metal from the inside to my structure. All right, so now that I got the structure all built, I need to go around and weld up all four corners, each one of those seams. And having a metal structure to weld against really helps prevent from blowing through that thin sheet metal. Really gives me something good to bite onto. Now, if I know I had a metal brake, I could bend two of the corners up because I could get it all out of one sheet, a face and a side out of one sheet. But if I went and bought that tool, then I'd have more commenters saying that, hey, I could build that if I had all those tools. So I got to try to kind of find the right balance between having all those tools and a little bit of maker struggle. So now that I got the base assembled, I need to build a mounting bracket to mount the tabletop to the table base. So this big hole I'm drilling is so I can drop a 1/4-20 bolt in there to bolt it to the table and then get a socket in there to tighten it down. So on the back side here, you can see that I have a 1/4-inch hole for the 1/4-20 bolt to slip through, and then the top allows me to get a socket in there to tighten it down. All right, so now for my favorite part of the build is the art portion of getting the color on the steel. So the first thing I need to do is get it really clean. Any kind of oil or debris left over from the manufacturing process is going to interfere with the copper from sticking to the steel. All right, so I use several different application methods to apply the copper, from spraying it on, pouring it on, dabbing it on with a sponge, even a chip brush or paint brush. Each one of those things creates a different pattern or different type of pattern and texture within the copper and the steel as I go. All right, so now that I have the base texture and pattern down, I'm going to start adding in the secret sauce. And this really brings out all the colors and textures and patterns and starts to etch in the pattern. Now this stuff is pretty acidic, so it's going to slowly eat away some of the lighter copper colors and turn those into green, and then some of the really heavy coppers will just end up being kind of a bright aged copper color. All right, so this is one of the biggest pieces I've done, and the reaction is starting to get away from me by the time I got all the way around, and so I'm starting to freak out a little bit because it's just happening too fast, and I'm not able to control the reaction and get the colors that I want. So I'm trying to sop up some of that excess chemical to slow it down to see if I can control the colors a little bit more. All right, so now I've realized there's some areas that the chemical sat too long and it pretty much went back to bare metal. So I'm trying to get it back to bare metal so that I can reapply my copper to try to blend it into the areas around it. So of course some of that acid kind of started to run into places that I wanted to keep that I was happy with. So it kind of became one of those things where you pick the scab off and then realize that it wasn't ready to come off and started to bleed, and things just kind of got away from me and turned into a big mess. But in the end, I was able to get it back to a pattern that I was happy with. All right, and there we go. Finished base in place with a big, thick, beefy slab of Wingay on top.